you ask God for a sign. Maybe you have a big decision to make. Maybe you have a small decision to make. If you're anything like me, there are times when I'm just driving home and I think, should I take 64 or should I take Olive? Well, if the light's green, then I'll go this way. And it's like almost a little test. I'm like, well, God, if you want to guide me in this, I'll go where you want me to go. And that's kind of silly, right? I mean, it's a very small thing. Sometimes we look for signs for big decisions about where to move to, whether or not to marry a person. And in this situation, the sign he's giving is really, really important. The sign he's giving is the birth of Jesus. I heard about a man once who would not get out of bed in the morning until he felt that God had given him direction to do so, had given him a sign that, okay, now it's time to get dressed. Now it's time to eat your breakfast. And that's kind of a terribly inefficient way to live your life. I think there are general understandings we have about God wanting us to go throughout our day. In this story, though, God was giving a specific circumstance. In the prophecy, it's not about one person getting up to eat breakfast. It's about the future of humanity and the deliverance of God's people. God's saying that he will take care of his people. He's making a promise to them, and to verify it, he gives them a sign. When God makes covenants, he sticks by them, and oftentimes he gives a sign of that covenant about his faithfulness. He does this with Noah on the ark. Do you remember what kind of sign he gave Noah when he said he would not flood the earth again? A rainbow, exactly. The earth was flooded, there was a big ark, there were a lot of animals, you remember the story? And God says, I will never flood the whole earth again, and so that you know it's true, here's a rainbow. Beautiful. He does this with Abraham in Genesis 15. God promises land to Abraham, and Abraham is like, well, how can we be sure? I don't know. And God makes a covenant with him. He gives him a sign. He made an oath. If you're not familiar with the story, it's a really, really interesting one where Abraham had to go get these animals, and in the culture at the time, they did this kind of oath where they split the animals in half, and then they lay either half kind of opposite each other, and then the two people making the covenant walk down the middle in between the two halves of the animals, as if to say, if I don't keep my side of this bargain, let what happened to these animals happen to me. And when God makes this covenant with Abraham, Abraham is actually asleep. God puts him into a deep sleep, and God goes himself between them. So he's saying, the entire burden of this covenant not being held is on me. He's not putting it on Abraham, which is crazy to think about. So when God is promising this through Isaiah, he's saying, I'm going to give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth, and you will call him Emmanuel. So with these signs, what kind of sign is this? If we're looking for a sign to do these things, to make decisions in our lives, sometimes they can be kind of small and ambiguous, like if I'm driving, if the light's green, then I guess I should go this way. But in Isaiah, it says, a virgin will give birth, which is impossible, right? We've taken health class. There are 3 young ones over there who haven't taken health class yet. But we know that doesn't happen. God's sign is not only unambiguous, it's impossible. And I don't want us to ever lose the amazement at the miraculous and impossible things that God does. So God's sign in sending Jesus can't be confused with anything else, because there is nothing else like it in the world. If you were a Hebrew person at this time and you heard about a person who is a virgin giving birth, that might set off some alarms. So, oh yeah, there was a prophecy about this, right? You wouldn't think, oh, that's totally normal. That's how that works. So his sign is distinct, it's direct, and it's effective. Because Jesus being born, as we all know, is not just a sign of God's faithfulness, not just a sign of keeping his promises. It is those things, but it's the start of something so much more, something much, much bigger. His life and his ministry on earth, his death and resurrection on the cross. His birth, his very birth, was the fulfillment of a covenant, and it was the start of an entirely new era in humanity. For example, what year is it? Does anyone know the year right now? Oh man, it's almost over. 2017. How did we determine that it was 2017? As humanity, did we just pick? 2017 years ago, we decided there was a year zero at the birth of Jesus. And obviously, like, there are, depending on how nerdy you are into theology, there's some debates on, well, he may have been born at year 4 or year 6 or something, and maybe he was born in the spring and not December, and that's fine. But the point is, the people on earth who have plenty to disagree over, the vast majority agree that the year is 2017, and that is based on the birth of Jesus. It is a shift in all of humanity. So Jesus' birth is a sign that was foretold in Isaiah. The other thing that the people were expecting was a king, right? Like Kathy said. They anticipated a king who would descend from the line of David, who would rule over Israel and defeat all the oppressors, and he would reign, and it would be glorious. And that's something that the Israelites really, really, really wanted, because they knew oppression. They understood it. Jewish people have been oppressed throughout all of history, and they desperately wanted a leader who could take care of them. So if you're a Jew at the time when Jesus was born, and you're waiting for a sign, you're waiting for a king. And kings, they live in castles, right? Or palaces, or at the very least, the nicest home available in their community, in their culture. And in monarchies, when a child is born to the king, then their father must be king, right? It's genetic. So you have King William II, King William III, all the way to like the 14th, you know? So that child is born into royalty, into the best that the culture has to offer. But as we know from Luke, Jesus was not born in a sterile hospital like we have today, or even born in the best living conditions of his time, immediately wrapped in a nice golden blanket or whatever the kings did back then, maybe some purple cloth. He was born outside because there was no place for them in the inn. In kind of Renaissance era times in England and France, I did a little bit of research on royal babies and royal births, and it's kind of crazy stuff that people used to do. Marie Antoinette gave birth with crowds of people around. Very awkward, very uncomfortable. No one wants that. But they did that so that they could verify that the baby she had was her baby. Because if it was just her having the baby, then they maybe switch the baby with someone else, and then that baby isn't going to be the king or queen. And there were all these different weird practices with royal births, that it's fanfare, it's news. People still in America get really excited about quote-unquote royal babies in England, which we haven't been subjected to England for quite a while, but it's the closest connection we have to a royal line. And so when you are expecting royal babies, it's an image of the future, because you see the king and queen you have, and you see that they're going to have a kid, and you know this kid is going to rule. This kid is going to be in charge of us. This kid is going to make decisions one day. So it's important for you. Can you imagine in our country the First Lady of the U.S. being pregnant, coming to your town, and not having anywhere to have the baby? Like, all the hospitals were closed. Everyone's homes were like, oh, sorry, this hotel is full. And she just, has the baby kind of in a cave somewhere, like Merrimack Caverns, I think, is somewhere near here. And then they put the baby in like a feeding trough. It's crazy to think about. Now, obviously, Mary was not royalty. She was a pretty normal lady. So the Jews weren't expecting that the king that they would have would be coming from her, that she would be the mother of the Messiah they're so desperately waiting for. And that's the third thing, is that Jesus does not fit our expectations. He is simultaneously more humble and more exalted than anything that we can conceive of or expect of him. The Jews wanted him to come in a chariot with this great massive thing in Jerusalem, with a sword, driving out oppressors, leading the Israelites, but he's a modest carpenter who has no place to rest his head. They wanted him to just be human and not make claims about being the Son of God, not accept how exalted he is, but he didn't fit that either. He never denies his humanity or his deity. So our expectations of Jesus are not always correct. Almost any expectation we have of Jesus before knowing him personally is going to be wrong. And expectations are a really, really important thing. At Thanksgiving, in my family, I expect that there's turkey, there's cheesy potatoes, there's this wild rice that my family makes, there's pumpkin pie. There are just certain dishes that are going to be there every year, right? And if that expectation isn't met, if we showed up and they said, well, we're going to have sushi, my wife would be very happy. I mean, we like sushi a lot, but that's not a Thanksgiving meal, right? It's an unmet expectation. Some of you have had met and unmet expectations in relationships, where you expect your friend to act a certain way, you expect your spouse to act a certain way, and when that's unmet, we get really confused and we don't know what to do with that. When we expect Jesus to just be a person, and then he dies for our sins and raises himself up from the dead, that's an unmet expectation in a very positive way. So in conclusion, we have all these prophecies about Jesus, about his birth, about his life, about his ministry, about his death and resurrection. In Isaiah 53, verses 1 through 6, we get a part of the Old Testament, a prophecy that I think is so distinct, is so impactful. I'd like to share with you today. Who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? He grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. Talking about Jesus. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hide their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions and crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us has turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. It seems distant, it seems unrelated, but the one who experienced this, who bore our sins, took up our pain and suffering, is the baby who came, the baby for whom there was all this anticipation. The king who was born in humility, the sign of God's promise, is Jesus. He was born into an impossible situation, unlike any other human. And after he bore the punishment we deserve on the cross, he rose again. Jesus does not fit neatly into our expectations, but as he breaks them by being more humble than we can understand and more exalted than we can imagine, we can know that God has been true to his word, that he cares for his people and he will deliver them, even if it requires sending his own son. into a world that doesn't receive him readily. So please, if the Lord who came to earth, fully God and fully man, who was miraculously born and miraculously rose again, if he is the God you worship, then please join me in the Apostles' Creed, declaring together what we believe as his sons and daughters. You can find it in the bottom of your folder.